crew here. Very much appreciate that. So, we're going to talk about context-driven AI for consistent, compliant, and compelling content. And today's presentation is brought to you by the letter C. All right, so hello, my name is Kristen Pol, and I am the project lead for the Context Control Center, which we're going to be talking about. I'm also the program manager for the Drupal AI initiative, which I'll touch upon briefly as well. And just before I move on, who here is more on the developer side of the house? Show of hands. Good chunk of you, maybe half the room. How about like marketing or content or that side of the world? A little less, maybe 10 or so. What about the rest of you guys? You're just here warming the seat. All right, gotcha. Okay, so first off, I'm going to just briefly touch upon the Drupal AI initiative. And actually, Martin talked about it a little bit earlier if you were here. But the AI initiative is a really amazing program that we're doing where we're bringing together partners and collaborators so that we can build something better than what we could do individually. So rather than working in silos, and open source is amazing. We could do amazing things with open source, but bringing that together and working collaboratively and trying to go much faster and at scale has been an amazing experience. So there are a number of folks in the room who are part of the initiative, and I'm very lucky to be working with them. So part of the Drupal AI initiative, this year we put out a roadmap and for 2026, and it has a number of capabilities that we're interested in pushing forward this year. And I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of the overview of the different capabilities. I'm not going to read you all of these slides or all of these bullets, but basically there's a number of areas that we want to push forward in 2026. And we went to the AI initiative partners and we tried to prioritize these so that we could understand what would be most beneficial to those partners and their businesses. The top three were page generation, context management, and advanced governance. Doesn't mean that these other ones are not important, but those were the ones that were voted for the most. And for today, I want to focus specifically on context management. So in Drupal, we have modules that we can install in order to unlock capabilities. And it seemed like most of the people are familiar with Drupal. As you know, there's a module for that, right? No matter what you want to do, there's a module for that. So no different, we have a module called AI Context. Now, it's also called Context Control Center, sort of a name that sort of caught on last year. There's a little bit of hesitancy. The developers in the house like to call it AI Context, and the more UXy people like to call it Context Control Center. So I've got both. So so I'm not going to go into bike shedding here about the name. But the idea behind it was last year before the Dries Note in Vienna, which for those that aren't familiar with Drupal, we have these Dries Note, but Dries is the founder of Drupal, and twice a year we have these big conferences. So before that Dries Note, we put together a prototype of AI Context of just a few weeks before the event so that we can demo some of the power of using context within page building, specifically with Canvas, which was, I think Scott mentioned. So the idea is that you can use the context in order to give the AI or the LLM more information about what you're trying to achieve and give it good information to get more relevant results. So since that time, that was a prototype back in September of last year, we've been heavily developing that into a more full-featured environment so that it could be used by a number of people, both technical and non-technical. So I'll just give you, I think this will work. I know that Martin was having trouble with videos. All right, so this is just an overview of Context Control Center. There's a little teeny dashboard just to get you started in case you've never used it. You can turn off the dashboard. If you go in, you can enter, or you can add context items. This context comes from the Dries Note that was in Chicago just a couple of months ago, where you can organize it by use cases, you can organize it by subcontext, and just any kind of context that makes sense for your particular site. So we'll go in, we'll edit one of the specific ones, abbreviations, spelling, dates, and formatting, something pretty standard that you might have on your website so that it gets some of the rules of your organization. Something that's useful is like do's and don'ts and examples of what's good and bad so that LLM can try to follow those. So that just gives you a rough idea of what the system looks like from the more of the end user, like a non-technical user. Now behind the scenes there's a lot of other configuration and stuff going on, and we'll touch upon that, but I'm not going to show all the screens there. So why does context matter? If you don't have any context, or if you have bad context, and you're trying to ask the LM to do something for you, you are probably going to get generic, guessy garbage. So that's our infamous AI slop. And I'm assuming pretty much everyone in the room has heard of AI slop. We don't like AI slop. We don't want it. So the idea instead is that we can use information that makes sense for your organization, your brand, your business rules, coming out of your human heads and also from your documentation or other assets, and use that, put it in one place, and then the AI could basically just take the stuff that makes sense for the task at hand. So we're not going to give you all of the context. You might have hundreds of things that you're managing in terms of context, and that wouldn't make sense, right? You don't want to blow out your context window. So you want to make sure that you're picking and choosing the most relevant context at hand, and then you can get accurate, authentic, aligned AI outputs. So the super important thing is we're focused on people. We're not focused on, all the, just whatever random AI thing that we're going to get back, right? We want to make sure that we are trying to understand what is our organization trying to do, what types of information, what are our business rules, what is our brand, what do we care about, and you need to codify that information into a system and then feed that into the LMs when it makes sense, or you're going to get that AI slop. So in terms of what you can actually use context for in order to improve your AI outputs, pretty much anything you can think of that you would use an LLM for, context can make a big difference. These are just some examples of what you can do, right? So pretty obvious one, you want content that makes sense for your brand. Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. You might want to have personalized experiences. So maybe you have certain persona rules in there that says that if it's this type of user, then do these types of things. Give this kind of information. You might have automation and workflows that you're working with. So there's a lot of stuff in here. I'm not going to read all the bullets, but the idea is anything that you have within Drupal, or even maybe outside of Drupal that you want to pull in Drupal context, then you would be able to improve those processes so you get better results. So here are just some more examples of for content generation, maybe you have brand and voice. You have certain things about editorial standards, your writing standards. For page building, what are the layouts that you care about? What are some examples of a certain, a campaign page versus a product page? For migrations, you might have some rules that you want to pull in that it's make sure to scrub this type of information, or maybe there's some PII stuff in there that you want to scrub out before it gets migrated. So I'm not going to read all of these, but you get the idea. You need to know what are the things that you're trying to achieve with the LLM, and where does context make sense, and then what is the context that is most suited for those particular activities. And that way you can map the context to the right agents that are supporting those. And yeah, basically you can think of context as anything textual. And even if it's an image, you could process it and get textual information out of the image, right? So it's infinite, and you don't have to have a website that's outwardly facing. Maybe it's an intranet, and you want to have stuff that makes sense for your operations or your sales team, any kind of automation, right? So you need to think broadly instead of context just being, oh, it's a brand guideline, or it's a editorial. That stuff is super amazing, but just you can think of it more holistically of writing the right context that makes sense for the right AI processes and tools you're using. So the whole point of Context Control Center is really to make some order out of all of this, since context can be all sorts of things and might be applied in lots of different situations. You want to be able to have some sort of structure to it and management so that both non-technical users, so your content editors, your writing staff, marketing folks that maybe aren't as technical, as well as your site builders and your developers, they all have a platform to be able to work together more holistically. So the features of Context Control Center, first off, is context management. And Drupal is a CMS, which is content management system. Context is content. So we want to be able to do all the things that we would expect from a content management system. Also, we have a way of scoping context, and this is a flexible system that lets you categorize your context. Maybe this context is only for French users. Maybe it's only for certain workflows in the system, certain languages or use cases, right? So you want to be able to categorize the context so that you're not necessarily polluting certain activities with context that doesn't matter for it. We have another thing called subcontext, where you can have hierarchies in order for structural reasons and also for pulling in conditional subcontext when it makes sense. And then there's a whole bunch of selection rules behind the scenes. So there's a lot of logic behind the scenes that's trying to figure out, okay, the LLM, you've got a prompt and there's an LLM, like what is the right context for this particular task at hand, given all the context we have and its categorization. There's also been a lot of work done on the admin experience and the developer experience. And so I'm a developer by training, but I've been an agency owner. I'm with the open source community forever. I've been in Drupal since 2004. So UX is really baked into all of the stuff that we try to do. And a shout out to Aidan Foster and Emma Harrell, who are like amazing UX people that I work a lot with. So we're always trying to figure out really good UX for the system. So on the context management side, all the things that you would sort of expect. So a lot of this is patterned off of Drupal CMS. If you go and you work with Drupal CMS, they have a lot of things out of the box. They have moderation, revision, scheduling, multilingual, and there's a WYSIWYG editor. So these are all the things that you would expect if you're managing content, and this just happens to be context. One thing of note, and we've talked about this a little bit already today, is that LLMs tend to like Markdown and tends to like structured information. So the WYSIWYG editor that we have is a Markdown editor. So out of the box with Drupal CMS, you get a CK editor, WYSIWYG editor, and we did try that with Markdown, and it wasn't quite cutting it for us, so we actually switched to a specific Markdown editor, which has been really, really nice. So, for non-technical people, it doesn't really matter. You can just be in WYSIWYG mode and add your headings and your, all of that stuff, and it's just as if you were working with CK editor. But you can also switch over to Markdown mode for those who are more comfortable with that. So this idea of scope these are Drupal plugins for those developers in the house, which is about half the room, I think, which means that you can add your own as well. So out of the box, actually there was one that I didn't add here that is a new one, but you can use these in order to take your context and say, oh, this context is global, for example. Now, global is an interesting one because if you mark context global, that's going into every prompt on your system. So be very careful, use that very judiciously, very small context, something that truly needs to go into everything. If you want to tell the LMs never do X, and it makes sense for pretty much anything that you're going to do on the site, then by all means, feel free to mark that as global. But then you can, there are use cases, so you might be writing words or working with Canvas, which is this page builder that we were talking about. Maybe you're writing code with, making code components or something, reviewing content. There's a number of ways that you can categorize your context in order to make it clear whether it's relevant for a particular task at hand. And then there's a number of other ones, like, you can scope, even if you're writing English content, you could tag it as being for, German or French, so that it only is relevant if you're working with those languages. You can also have certain sites, sections of the site, like if you have marketing pages that are under, blogs and, products, and then you have HR pages, which are at careers and about. You can actually have different contexts that's applied to different parts of the website, which can be very handy, and then, tagging and things like that. So this idea of subcontext, if you just have a little bit of context on your site, then you probably won't need to bother with subcontext, but this can be very helpful if you want to organize your context in a hierarchy. There is only one level deep. We didn't want to make it go crazy because it could be end up being very complicated if it was deeply nested. But so you can do it for organization, and you could also do it for something called conditional context. Now, conditional context is like the example at the bottom. So we have general page building guidelines, and underneath it, there's 3 conditional context items where it's like, okay, if I'm working with an article and blog, here's my specific page building guidelines. But if I'm working with product pages, here's my other one. So you could actually have some general guidelines up top and then conditional context underneath, and then it can just pull in the context that makes sense for it. If it's so there's 2 kinds. The required context is more of an organizational thing, and so the little angle bracket is for required, and the other one is for conditional. If you have subcontext and you could actually even, there's ways in the system of hardwiring context of even if it's subcontext to a specific agent. So you could always have something like the abbreviation spelling, and you could say always use it for, I don't know, the Canvas page building agent. If you wanted to make that a hard requirement, you could do that. So there's some flexibility there. And I'm not going to go over all the rules. There's a lot of different rules here, but there is a lot of logic behind the scenes to try to figure out what is the right context for the task at hand. So if you were to, you're using a prompt, and it doesn't have to be, a chat, but say you're at in the chat in Drupal, and you say, build me a page about calculators. Then it goes to the agent, and then there's a process that goes and tries to find the right context for that particular task at hand. Happens to know you're building in Canvas for the Canvas page builder. It's going to go and try to find the most relevant information for that page building task, and then it's going to pass that back. So there's a number of criteria that it needs to be published. We don't, if it's unpublished, we're not going to use it. We have some hard overrides that you can always include certain contexts for certain agents or never include them. And we have the global and the other scope and the subcontext rules. And there's some limits, right? So, we default to like 10 total context items. If you were to blow that out to 100 or something, then you're going to be blowing out your context window, right? So there's some tuning that you can do based on your organizational, rules, and that's more of a back-end person would do that. If you are a developer and you want to extend the system, you can create a custom module or a contrib module and add use cases. You could add scope plugins. You can, pre-process context before it gets injected into the prompt. So, there's some flexibility there as well. And so we have been doing a lot of building. We released a beta 1 at DrupalCon Chicago. Over the weekend, I pushed the button. We released beta 2. So we are looking for more beta testers, please. And yeah, it's a labor of love. There's a lot of us working together. So please join us, do some testing, create some, bug reports or feature requests. So, but the whole point, our whole vision is we want to be that source of truth for context connecting Drupal, external systems, and AI all in one place. And it's that knowledge base, it's that hub, and also, it's not just within Drupal, but also being able to pull context from other places as well. So like I said, release the beta. There's actually an article that talks about kind of what's the difference between beta 1 and beta 2, some of the things that are in there. And so June, we're looking at 1.0, which will have all the things that I just mentioned, as well as it'll probably have one of the items that's under 1.1, which is the common sources. So being able to just upload a PDF and it pulls it into Markdown, point it at one URL and it pulls it into Markdown. So some little helper things, we're hoping to pull that in the next week or two. But the September release, which probably will be a beta, but that will be for Rotterdam, which is the next big conference. That's going to be focused more, so we've been focused more internally, and then for the external, pulling external context and those integrations with like Google Analytics or Google Docs or that sort of thing is more of a September sort of time frame. All right, and if you are interested in learning more, there was a Dries Note in Chicago, which had demoed a lot of the context along with Canvas, the page builder in Canvas. And also I did a longer version of this with Aidan Foster from Foster Interactive in Chicago as well. That recording is also available. So definitely if you're gonna watch those, it'd be good to watch the Dries Note first, and then you have some context. About the 1 hour mark, I think, is when our stuff starts. You should watch the whole thing, but just saying, if you want to cut off an hour, you could do that. And if you want to try out Context Control Center with Canvas, there's 2 ways of doing that. You can install on your local for the developers in the house. We have a GitHub repo that is on Foster Interactive website. That was the code that was used for the Dries Note in March. Also, if you want to do a cloud install just to try it out, we have it on Drupal Forge as well. So with that, thank you very much. These are ways of getting a hold of me. Did I say I'm at Salsa Digital? I might have missed that in the beginning. I'm with Salsa Digital. They're out of Australia. I'm in California. This is how you can get a hold of me. Email, maybe not so much. Drupal Slack, perfect. LinkedIn, next best. The QR code is for LinkedIn. So connect, and yeah, if there's time for questions, I'm not sure. For 1 or 2 maybe.
I'm not going to try the mic now. I asked for some help.
Yell.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Nobody's quicker than me.
Yeah.
Are there plans for dynamic context?
Yes. So so we played around with that a little bit for this in March for like getting in Google Analytics in or things like that. Or what do you mean by? Let's clarify. What do you mean by dynamic context?
I'm thinking about like if you're allowed your customer or your user who is not an administrator who's visiting your site to do things that based on their user profile you would have different context.
Yeah, so that would be like a use case driven. So you could add a use case, which was like their user role, and then you could make context that's only for certain user roles for like personalization or something like that.
I'm thinking,
not quite the same.
I'm thinking like, so you have a user who works at a certain company.
Yeah.
And then based on the products that company has bought, you give that as context, like this customer has bought these products, so don't show them advertisement for products that they've already bought.
Okay, so personalized context for that person, so it's associate the personalized context that's dynamic for each, because it's changing all the time and whatever. Okay, so that's good. Make an issue in the queue. We're touching upon that with a bunch of other things, like pulling in dynamic context from like Google Analytics or whatever. I mean, there might be like maybe from some CRM, there might be information or something that we could. So basically, there'll be integrations with a number of sources, and that would be a potential integration, I think, as well. So yeah, make an issue, and we'll get to work on that tomorrow. All right. All right. Who else we got? Oh, okay. So the question is, what are the prerequisites for using context? Like, do I need Canvas or something? No. So the idea is it works with out-of-the-box vanilla Drupal. It also works with out-of-the-box Drupal CMS. And you do need a little bit higher level of, we have something called AI Core that we build on top of, a Drupal AI Core. So you need to be up to 3.3 or something, but it's in the dependencies. So as long as you can install it on the site, you can start using it. But you do need a little bit, so, obviously non-technical users can enter the context in. You do need someone like a site builder or someone to configure it on the back end. So, and they don't have to be super, know that much about AI or whatever, but they need to be able to just, do some mapping and, categorizing and things so that it's going to the right LLMs for, based, or to the right agents based on what, context that you have. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
What's the markdown editor that you're using?
Yeah, we're using MDX editor. It's actually a really amazing markdown editor, and that's something that we're adding in. So I mentioned that we're going to get the plugin, or we're going to be able to, upload a PDF or point it at a URL. We're doing a custom button in the MDX editor where you'll be able to just push the button and then upload a PDF or point it at a URL and then pull that in behind the scenes, and then it would just go right into the markdown directly in the editor. So that's hopefully coming in a week or two. I think it was another question, yeah.
Thank you for all this work. This is super cool. Question about the decision to make all of this content as opposed to configuration. I'm just curious about how you came to that decision. It feels like it might be convenient to deploy some changes to this as part of a release or something. But
Yeah, so the question is, why is this content rather than config? And that's actually a really good question. So the prototype version was actually using config and not content. But we realized we want non-technical people to be able to use this. And we want to be able to have moderation and revisions and all of, being able to revert and all these things. And we, wanted that available to them. So we basically, so there was a prototype, we just kind of threw away the prototype and started over and did a content editing. It doesn't mean that maybe we won't have some other config entities that might make sense in terms of context. So the idea is just to have a foundational platform that we can extend with, submodules or contrib modules and, we were talking about being able to pull in maybe code snippets as examples. Well, we're not going to want to put that in the UI. I mean, that doesn't necessarily make sense. So, so we need to figure out what's the best way to serve that up as context, and maybe it, as a content entity, it doesn't make sense. So we're evolving.
very cool.
We need
Okay.